Mark Hendricks, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with a basic one. How often have you climbed the rock?
Oh, Andrew, I've climbed 4 times. So the first time back in 1998 with, of all people, a NASA scientist, so a NASA planetary scientist who'd come to Australia, to Central Australia, because it looked so much like Mars, and he was actually involved in the Mars Pathfinder mission. So that first time that I climbed is sort of quite a special memory for me.
And how many Australians have made this climb? Because I feel it's almost like part of our culture.
It's not only a part of, say, white Australian culture. I think it's deeply ingrained in Aboriginal culture. This is something that's overlooked by Parks Australia when it promotes the idea that, you know, Arn and you never climbed the rock. So based on the Parks figures and their estimates of the proportion of climbers, around about 7 million people have climbed since 1958 when records were first kept at the rock, yeah. So a lot of them would be foreigners, but I would presume a fair bit would be Australians. 7 million, that's a lot. What do you think climbing the rock means to them? I mean, obviously for some it's just an adventure, you know, tick a box kind of thing. But what do you think it means beyond that? I think, you know, there's been a mystique built up about the climb over the years, over the decades, and it really is an integral part of our sense of being Australian, I think. You know, the one thing about those desert views, which are just so stunning and so different from what those of us who dwell on the coast are so used to, and it's part of really an adventure of going to Central Australia and just seeing something that's just totally mind-bogglingly different. And the other thing about it is it's a real physical adventure. You know, one thing that's been overlooked also in the last sort of 2 years we've been having this debate about the ban is that it's a really fun thing to do. And that's sort of been also glossed over by Parks Australia. So it's a real adventure, and it's an educational opportunity as well. So people learn a lot about the geology of Central Australia by visiting the Ayers Rock and learning about the geology, although, again, the emphasis on the scientific side of the origin of the rock is very much downplayed by Parks Australia as well in all its official guides. Now,
you've studied this a fair bit. You've dug up lots of archival footage and things like that. When did climbing Uluru or Ayers Rock, when did it become an alleged insult to Aboriginal culture?
So the park was officially declared in 1958, right up until the late 1980s. There was nothing said about the climb being any problems with the traditional owners. In fact, in the 1987 World Heritage nomination, which was one that was for landscape values, and they also nominated it at the same time for cultural values, the description of the views in that document referred to a shared cultural history. So it was Aboriginal culture and it was white Australian culture. And indeed, I think it's a universal cultural aspect that people want to climb up and look at a great view. So it wasn't until 1991 that we heard from Parks Australia in its management plan at the time that Arn and you never climb. And from then on, there have been moves to, firstly, I guess, reduce the emphasis of the climb locally, but also then down the track to actually ban people climbing the rock. So it's 1991 is that critical date where these things sort of started.
Well, how much credence do you give it to the notion that there is a cultural taboo on climbing the rock? I mean, maybe it is now a cultural taboo, maybe it wasn't before. If it was an invention, is it really, how are we to regard this?
I think it's a feeling that's deeply felt by the current owners, and they, to me, I think they come from another part of that local area. So up until the mid-1980s, the traditional owners and those who were regarded as principal owners of the rock, these are men like Paddy Uluru and Tiger Jackal Airy, they were born at the rock. So after they died, they were replaced by a group of Aboriginal elders who came from outside and perhaps had different views about how sacred the rock was. So that's this big contradiction we have, you know. So when we go back and we look at that early history, we find that there really wasn't a problem with the climb. In fact, we know, and we showed that wonderful footage earlier in the year that was restored by the Lutheran Archives of Tiger Jackal Airy and Mitch and Jerry Mick climbing with some men from Adelaide, and we know from photos from locals that Aboriginal women actually climbed the rock as well. So the idea that it was a sacred men's area is also quite contested. So we're faced with this real contradiction between this earlier history where Aboriginal people had no problem climbing the rock, with this later one where they seem to have a great problem with visitors climbing. And it hasn't been explained.
What do you think this is? Well, what do you think marks a change? You're suggesting part of it comes from the fact that you now have people speaking for the traditional owners who originally came from a different part of the countryside. Is it also, I'm just wondering, is it about power or is it about religion?
Oh, I think it's all muddled up together, and the other aspect to it as well is what Parks Australia has been doing over this whole time. So when you look at the early involvement and the early questions that Parks Australia had about safety, for instance, the emphasis for them was always about reducing risk. And I think there is evidence to suggest that concerns about being sued by visitors about accidents or deaths on the rock has been passed across to the local owners, and some of these concerns about the legal aspects of it are driving them into accepting the notion, or rejecting rather, the earlier views of past elders that the climb was okay, and driving them more towards the view that the climb is something that shouldn't be done.
Well, I would have thought making people sign a release form at the bottom of the climb would be the way of getting out of that. Because,
management of the climb is a completely different issue, and I think we've seen recently with, Parks Australia have really managed this last couple of months really quite poorly, in my view. The crowd crush we saw in the last couple of weeks of people milling at the bottom of the climb, that slope it's a 45-degree slope, Andrea. It's quite dangerous to allow that to happen. And you've done the climb, so you know the sort of situation. We had a 12-year-old girl have an accident in the last couple of weeks there. I think, partly perhaps Parks Australia could have managed this whole closure period much better and prevented the possibility of those sorts of things happening. Some perhaps would say that, those incidents are being used as a bit of a tool against climbers, which would be, it's quite sad that Parks Australia would be managing the climb in such a way that it's creating a risk.
Yeah, well, I think you can engineer that climb a little bit better with chains and more safety if that's really your go. But you're taking away the capacity of other people to make that choice for themselves. If anyone is now enthused to climb, they've got tomorrow and then it's over. Mark Hendricks, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.